Welcome to Readings from Roberto, bringing you the wisdom and experience of Roberto Assagioli and Psychosynthesis through readings of his essays and lectures. We hope you enjoy this and gain a benefit that can be shared with others. Parsifal by Dr. Roberto Assagioli. This essay was written in 1937 and also published in 1968. It was intended originally to be accompanied by selections from a recording of the opera. This essay is translated from Italian and read by Jan Kuniholm. To fully understand the profound esoteric meaning of the opera Parsifal, the masterpiece that is the crowning achievement of Richard Wagner's artistic activity, that was first performed in 1882, it would be necessary to examine the entire cycle of his previous works and study their symbolism. In fact, there is a close connection, not apparent and external, but deep and intrinsic, between Wagner's various works from The Flying Dutchman onwards. Indeed, his prose writings and correspondence clearly show that this connection was conscious and intentional. I cannot go into detail here about the various and complex correspondences and spiritual and also musical resonances that exist between Wagner's various operas. I will limit myself to briefly mentioning how each of them represents a different phase of the multiple experiences, travails, and struggles that the human soul must go through on its long earthly pilgrimage before obtaining redemption. In Wagner's works, two moments typical of this evolution of the soul are particularly represented. Two decisive battles on whose outcome the fate of the human being will depend for a long time to come. The first of these evolutionary critical points is the conflict between the thirst for life and enjoyment, the desire for possession and domination on the one hand, and the spirit of compassion and sacrifice on the other. Wagner shows us, with all the persuasive force of his sincere and lived conviction, and with all the power of his artistic genius, how the thirst for possession and domination, symbolized above all in the fatal ring of the Nibelung, necessarily leads, through a long series of errors and offenses, to final ruin and destruction. While compassion makes us wise and capable of redeeming others, while renunciation and sacrifice, to those who know how and are willing to accomplish them, give freedom and self-redemption. The second struggle, repeatedly represented by Wagner and closely connected with the previous one, is that between earthly love, based upon selfish desire and instinctive attraction, and spiritual love, made up of absolute reciprocal dedication, in which the ordinary personality is transformed and transcended, and the souls, abandoning the bonds and limitations of earthly life, set out towards a more complete realization of their inner union on the higher planes of being. Richard Wagner has given us the most universal and concise representation of all these events and struggles in his opera Parsifal. At the same time, he has shown the highest justification, showing the sublime peak to which they lead, the triumph of the human spirit, the conscious communion of the soul with the divine, and the marvelous beneficial power that derives from it, the power to help and redeem others with the magical virtue of love and compassion. I need not dwell on the fact that this whole setting of the Wagnerian dramas has a quality, indeed a profoundly mystical spirit, in the fullest sense of liberation and redemption, or that it is a wonderful illustration of the universality and value of our fundamental principles. But this commonality is not limited to these principles. In fact, there are many other points of agreement on particular correspondences, some of which are truly surprising and deserve to be emphasized. We will now indicate some of the most important among the many found in Parsifal. The way in which the genesis of Parsifal took place in Wagner's mind is very remarkable and significant from our point of view. The first seeds of it are found in two previous sketches, one of a Christian opera and the other of a Buddhist one. As early as 1843, Wagner had written Supper of the Apostles, also called the Feast of Pentecost in English, which was performed for a religious ceremony with a hidden orchestra and choirs, as is also used in the temple ceremony in Parsifal. In 1848, he sketched in great detail a drama entitled Jesus of Nazareth, and 8 years later he outlined a Buddhist drama entitled Die Sieger, or The Victors, in which the Buddha himself was to appear on stage, and the main points of his teachings were to be developed, especially the sublime principle of sympathy and compassion for all living things, and the doctrines of reincarnation and karma. But later, Wagner chose to use mythical rather than historical figures on the stage, and for this reason, as well as for other perhaps more profound reasons, he decided to blend together the essential characters of those two great masters and redeemers of humanity in the mythical character of Parsifal, making him the hero in a sacred drama. In this opera, the highest and most universal elements of Buddhism and Christianity are harmoniously interwoven, or rather fused, in a wonderful synthesis that, while fully satisfying our aesthetic sense, our moral conscience, and our rational needs, also expresses and identifies perfectly with our ethical, spiritual conception of the fundamental unity that exists among the guiding principles of all religions. The plot of Parsifal is taken from various medieval legends concerning the Holy Grail, the mysterious talisman to which magical and spiritual powers were attributed. Following Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, Wagner placed Montsalvat, the castle where the Grail is kept, in northern Gothic Spain, while in Moorish Spain there is the Castle of Perdition, built by the magician Clingsor to tempt and defeat the Knights of the Grail. These knights live in Montsalvat as the chosen guardians of the Grail Cup, from which emanates a divine radiation of strength, love, and compassion. They are united by bonds of brotherly love and by the sacred vow to go out into the world to bring comfort and help to the weak and oppressed. Everyone will remember how this mystical brotherhood was introduced by Wagner in another of his operas, Lohengrin, which, although composed many years before Parsifal, is, in terms of the chronological sequence of the events represented, the sequel to it. The meaning of the name Parsifal has been interpreted in many different ways. One interesting explanation derives the ancient French form of the name Perceval from the Latin phrase per se stesso, meaning which is valid for itself. That is to say, that he made and perfected himself without outside help. This corresponds very well both to the life of Parsifal as it is narrated to us by the legend, and to a fundamental law of spiritual development, that which requires that the disciple temper and perfect himself with only his own efforts. Wagner, however, chose the Persian form of the name, Parsifal, which means the pure, simple. This choice was opportune, since the Persian form reveals the inner nature of the hero more profoundly than the Latin form. He is an uneducated, naive, and spotless young man, gifted with a big heart that gives him the power to identify with others, to relive their experiences and their pain. By means of this power of sympathy and compassion, he will become strong and wise. He will pass through all the temptations unscathed. He will learn the causes of the pain in the world, and will be able to heal and redeem others. But the true nature of Parsifal, and the spiritual principle he represents, will become clearer and more evident from the whole drama and the character of his music. Let us now proceed to examine these. Parsifal begins with a musical prelude in which the essential principles of the drama are expressed with suggestive effectiveness and marvelous artistic mastery. According to Wagner's own interpretation, these principles are love, faith, and hope. The first theme is that of the mystic supper, which could also be called the theme of spiritual love. This is also the main theme of the sacred agape, or love scene, in the first act, in which the bread and wine consecrated by the Grail mystically represent the body and blood of the Redeemer, sacrificed by him for the love of humanity. In fact, that motif is sung with the words, "Take this my body, take my blood, in token of our love." The motif is made up of a simple and broad melodic phrase, pervaded by a great sweetness, and at the same time by a deep and intimate religiosity. The prelude begins with this motif, which is then repeated 3 times with a delicate and ethereal accompaniment. This is followed by the motif of the Grail. This motif, taken from the Gregorian Gloria and the Amen of the Saxon liturgy, has a profound mystical character due to the austere simplicity of the chords it uses. The ascending progression of these chords, and above all, its second phrase an octave higher, which constitutes a kind of sublimated echo of the first in a higher sphere of life. This is followed by the faith motif, short, clear, resolute, and powerful, like a decisive and triumphant affirmation of the spirit. It is repeated twice in higher octaves and with a more mystical accent, and is then developed in the form of a chorale. This first part of the prelude, pervaded by a lofty and luminous spirituality, is followed by a part full of heart-rending human pain, with an impressive contrast. As critic and conductor Maurice Kufferath rightly says, the dazzling harmonies are followed by a muffled sonority, which produces the effect of a darkening after a bright and shining light. From the depths of the bass, the first theme, that of love, begins to rise, but it is abruptly interrupted halfway through with a painful wrench. The middle part of the theme is then repeated separately, like a cry of pain that grows increasingly acute. It signifies both the Redeemer's agonizing passion and the lament wrung from the sinful king Amfortas by the anguished sufferings of his wounded body and his remorseful soul. This theme is followed by another, also based on the theme of love, and more precisely on the last part of it, which here and then throughout the whole drama indicates the Holy Lance, the one that pierced the side of the Christ, and then also caused the wound of Amfortas at the hands of the magician Clingsor, who was able to take possession of it when Amfortas let himself be seduced by Kundry. This motif, too, has a profoundly sorrowful character. The final part of the prelude is again gentle and spiritual, given by the musical motif of love that is repeated in ever higher octaves and is lost in a series of chords, yielding, as writer Hans von Wolzogen says, like imagery of the holy hope of believers in infinite divine love that lasts beyond pain and death. The structure of this prelude, which will be performed now, clearly shows how Wagner's music has a very special character, how every melody, every harmony, every combination of sounds in it has a particular and profound musical, psychological, and spiritual meaning. For this reason, listening to it requires a broad intellectual and artistic preparation, and a fine intuition of spiritual matters to appreciate all its complex beauty and fully understand its innermost meaning. The prelude to the opera is to be played at this time. The scene of the first act represents a forest in the domains of the Grail. From afar, as if coming from the castle, we hear the first theme of the prelude, the motif of love and the mystic supper. At this sound, Gurnemanz, one of the knights of the Grail, awakens, and having roused the squires who are close to him, kneels and prays with them. Gurnemanz is a figure similar to Wolfram in Wagner's opera Tannhäuser, and to Hans Sachs in the opera Die Meistersinger. He represents intelligence or faithful devotion, but without that form, that impetus, and that fire of the soul, which, while it can lead to sin, can also redeem from it and raise one to the highest levels of spiritual development. After the prayer, 2 knights enter and talk to Gurnemanz about the increasingly tormented sufferings of King Amfortas, which are effectively expressed through music. Suddenly, a wild figure of a woman rushes onto the scene. It is Kundry. Her meaning is deep and complex. It can be summarized by saying that she represents the principle of the passivity of matter, the protean substance of nature, which can be used for good or evil by the will of man. In fact, we see that Kundry, when she is under the spiritual influence of the Grail, is a humble and devoted servant of the knights, while when she falls under the spell of the magician Clingsor, she becomes an instrument of his evil intentions. Gurnemanz, at the request of the squires, tells the story of the fall of Amfortas. He begins by recalling the sacred origins of the Order of the Grail. Amfortas's father Titurel, whom he calls a pious hero, received the Grail chalice and the Holy Lance from a group of angels. While Gurnemanz tells the story with the words, "To him once, on a sacred and solemn night, the blessed messengers of the Redeemer bowed," we hear the musical theme of the miracle of the Grail, whose unique harmonies correspond well to the sacred and mysterious character of the great event. The chalice and the lance also have special spiritual meanings. The chalice represents the feminine principle of love and intuitive wisdom, while the lance symbolizes the masculine principle of will. In spiritual language, we can say that both represent the manifestation of life of the sixth principle of Buddhi, what Buddhists call the faculty of direct spiritual awareness. This, in fact, as is well known, is the principle of intuition and of union, but it is also, as the vehicle of Atma, that is, a pure spirit, the principle of will. Titurel, after he had received the mystic chalice and the sacred lance, built the castle of Montsalvat to guard them, and founded the Order of the Knights of the Grail. He admitted only the pure of heart to this order, and therefore rejected the magician Clingsor. Clingsor had subjected himself to forced chastity through a violent act against himself, but in his heart impure passions continued to burn. Clingsor, furious at the refusal, used his magic art to create an enchanted castle and garden, and populated them with female creatures who were to seduce the knights. Titurel, having become old, had named his son Amfortas as his successor. The latter, forgetting that the sacred lance should never be separated from the chalice, or, symbolically, that will should never be separated from wisdom and love, imprudently attacked Klingsor's castle with the lance alone. But he fell prey to Kundry's seductions, so that Clingsor was able to take possession of the lance and use it to wound Amfortas in the side. The wound makes him suffer much, and will not heal. Amfortas, returning to the castle of Montsalvat, and prostrate before the shrine in ardent prayer, begged for a sign of redemption, and then from the Grail rose a luminous figure who pronounced the divine promise of the coming of a Redeemer. The pure, simple one, wise through compassion, await him, my chosen one. The musical theme of this promise has a simple and pure melodic line, combined with an original harmonic structure with continuous changes of tonality, producing a musical effect that corresponds well to the superhuman and mysterious character of the angelic messenger and his promise. As Gurnemanz ends his tale, a wounded swan appears, fluttering and then falling to the ground. Behind it runs Parsifal, armed with a bow. Here, as in Lohengrin, the swan accompanies the coming of the liberator, and the same musical motif, pervaded by sweetness and peace, is used. When Parsifal arrives, the musical motif that characterizes him is heard, a motif with a rapid and decisive rhythm, a virile and heroic motif. Parsifal is severely reprimanded for his cruelty in striking the swan, and for the first time he shows compassion and breaks the bow that was his only weapon. Meanwhile, Kundry, who has been taking part in the conversation by giving information about Parsifal's mother, feels a deep drowsiness invading her. She knows where it comes from. It is the telepathic suggestion from the magician Klingsor. She tries to resist, but in vain. She says, "Vain resistance, the moment has come. To sleep, I must," and falls plunged into a deep hypnotic sleep. We will see its meaning and consequences later on. Gurnemanz has a vague suspicion that the apparently stupid young man is the promised liberator, and decides to let him assist in the ceremony that is about to take place in the temple. As they go toward the castle, the strong sound of the bells can be heard. Gurnemanz and Parsifal enter the temple, while knights advance from the side aisles, divided into two ranks, singing a solemn hymn, and while the orchestra powerfully echoes the harmonies of the Grail. The music for this scene is a simple and grand orchestral piece, in which the themes of the bells and the Grail alternate and combine with great expressive effectiveness. The ranks of knights are followed by Amfortas, carried on a litter. From above comes the sound of youthful voices singing. Then an even more ethereal choir is heard coming from the top of the dome. There follows a moment of silence, broken by the deep voice of the old man, Titurel, who invites Amfortas to fulfill his office. The wounded king refuses with desperate expressions and invokes death. But while he falls back exhausted, from the top of the dome the voices sing the divine promise of the coming of the liberator. Titurel commands, "Uncover the Grail!" And Amfortas, with a supreme effort, prepares to perform the sacred rite. The golden chest is opened, and the Holy Grail appears, before which the king prostrates himself in silent and ardent prayer. A mysterious darkness fills the temple, while the choirs from the dome sing, on the theme of the mystic supper, the words, "Take this my body, take my blood, in token of our love." Then a dazzling ray descends upon the chalice and makes it glow vividly. Amfortas, transfigured, lifts it and waves it slowly, blessing the bread and wine, which are then divided among the knights. During the supper, the mystic choirs echo from above. Throughout the ceremony, Parsifal has remained motionless and intent until Amfortas has uttered his anguished cries of pain. Then he had convulsively clasped his hands to his heart and held them thus until the end. After the knights had left, Gurnemanz approached Parsifal and asked him if he understood what had happened. Parsifal, still in a daze, shook his head. Then Gurnemanz said harshly, "After all, you're just a fool," and pushed him out the door, ordering him to leave. But as Gurnemanz is leaving, a voice from above repeats in a solo, very softly, the words of the divine promise, "The pure and simple, wise through compassion." This last scene not only has great dramatic value, but also a particular spiritual meaning. Parsifal has empathized with Amfortas through a pure act of sympathy, or in other words, through the unitive power of the Buddhi. He has therefore relived in himself the physical and moral sufferings of King Amfortas. But his mind is still underdeveloped. He has not been able to understand, to translate his profound inner experience into intellectual terms. He has therefore not been able to answer the question that Gurnemanz asked him in mental terms. Precisely this is Gurnemanz's serious mistake, which is the frequent serious mistake we continually make, that of not recognizing the silent but eloquent messages of intuition. It is the mistake of asking the spiritual principle within us for answers formulated in concrete, analytical, and discursive terms, when instead it can and wants to teach us only with that synthetic, symbolic, and vital language that is suited to the nature of those messages. In the second act of the opera, we are transported to the castle of perdition of the magician Clingsor, and in the first scene we find ourselves in the midst of occultism. Clingsor, using magic, burning incense, and making ritual gestures, invokes the spirit of Kundry, or rather her entity. In his sentences of evocation, he calls her by the names she had in previous incarnations, Herodias, Kundrygia. She appears among the incense smoke and at first rebels against Clingsor and mocks him, but then he cleverly manages to induce her to do what he wants, to become an instrument of temptation for Parsifal. This whole scene contains very interesting ideas that show the depth of Wagner's occult knowledge, but I can't stop to explain them here. In the following scene, Parsifal appears and is at first surrounded by the flower maidens, but he easily overcomes their flattery and seduction. The flower maidens symbolize the frivolous pleasures of the senses, the vain goods of the world, and the small temptations of everyday life. Those who have overcome these must face other, deeper and more insidious temptations. So, while Parsifal turns his back on the flower maidens, he is arrested by the insinuating voice of Kundry. She begins to speak to him movingly about his mother, Herzeleide, and the pain he caused her by abandoning her, pain that led to her death. This makes Parsifal burst into expressions of pain and repentance. Kundry shrewdly takes advantage of this and offers him the love that united Herzeleide to Gamuret, his father, as consolation. She puts her arms around his neck and gives him a long kiss on the lips. But instead of letting himself be overcome by the seductive spell, Parsifal jumps to his feet, horrified, and clutches his heart convulsively with his hands, crying out, Amphratos! The wound! The wound burns in his heart. And he has a vision of Amphrotos's seduction and its terrible consequences. Kundry again tries to win him over, trying to inspire pity in him, but in vain. He replies, I am also sent for your salvation, if you will restrain your desire. The consolation that will end your suffering cannot be drawn from the source from which it springs. She insists on asking him for earthly love, and he rejects her. She then bursts into angry cries and curses Parsifal's path, invoking that he may never again find the way to the Grail he is seeking. Meanwhile, Clingsor appears and hurls the holy lance at Parsifal, but instead of hitting him, it remains suspended above his head. He grabs it and makes the sign of the cross with it, invoking the destruction of Klingsor's dwelling. The castle collapses, and the garden is transformed into a desert. Kundry falls with a cry, and Parsifal walks away, saying to her, You know where only you can find me. This whole scene is full of deep spiritual meaning, which would require lengthy consideration. I will limit myself to saying briefly that the scene between Parsifal and Kundry represents a very important phase of spiritual development, one of the decisive struggles mentioned above that take place between the various forces that make up the complex human entity. More precisely, Kundry and Parsifal represent the two different aspects, the two opposite poles of love, passionate love and spiritual love. In human life, they act and react continuously on each other. The passionate element always tends to drag the spiritual element down to its own level in order to enslave it, while spiritual love aspires to purify and redeem that lower reflection, elevating it and reabsorbing it into itself. Thus, Parsifal, while rejecting Kundry's seductions, offers to redeem her, and while he must temporarily abandon her, following her refusal to accompany him to perform the pious work of redeeming Amphratos, he tells her as a supreme warning, invitation, and promise, You know where only you can find me. That is, in the sacred domains of the Grail, in the highest planes of the spirit. The music for this whole act, which we cannot present here due to lack of space and time, powerfully renders and accentuates all the meanings of the drama, with its motifs and harmonies that are at times gloomy and dark, at times full of sensual and passionate charm. In the third act of the opera, we are transported back to the domain of the Grail. Several years have passed, and the conditions of the community have worsened. Amphratos has refused to uncover the Holy Grail again to perform the sacred rite, and the knights, deprived of the consecrated food and spiritual help emanating from the Grail, have ceased to perform their noble deeds, and are each thinking of their own sustenance, searching for herbs and forest roots. Titurel is dead, and Gurnemanz has retired to a solitary hut. It is dawn on Good Friday. Gurnemanz hears a lament, and discovers Kundry in a bush, dressed in a rough penitent's habit, rigid and apparently on the verge of death. Let's remember that she also symbolizes the natural forces, dormant during the winter, and now about to reawaken with the spring. Gurnemanz can hardly revive her. How different she looks now! She has a humble and sorrowful demeanor, and the only words she will utter throughout the act are, Serve, serve. Suddenly, a knight appears, completely covered in armor, holding a lance. When he raises his visor, Gurnemanz recognizes him with deep emotion as Parsifal, and asks him where he comes from. By paths of error and pain I have come, Parsifal replies, always seeking the one whose bitter lamentations I once heard with foolish amazement, and to whom I can now consider myself chosen to bring healing. Parsifal says that he has brought back the Holy Lance. He never had to use it in the battles he had to face, and in fact, he brings it back intact and pure, but at the cost of many wounds. These words clearly symbolize an important and severe spiritual law, namely, that the spiritual powers acquired must never be used for personal purposes, for one's own advantage and defense, but must be reserved only for works of love, for the redemption of others. A beautiful scene follows in which a series of cleansing rites are performed. Kundry washes Parsifal's feet. Then Gurnemanz wets his head with water and blesses him with the words, "May you also be blessed through the pure element." Then Kundry takes a vial from her robe and anoints Parsifal's feet with the ointment it contains, drying them with her hair. Gurnemanz in turn anoints his head, consecrating him king of the Grail. Then Parsifal sprinkles water on Kundry's head, saying, "Thus do I fulfill my first duty. Be baptized and believe in the Redeemer." And the woman bows her head to the ground and bursts into tears. In this scene, the various initiations through which the inner principles, represented by the various characters, have been purified, sublimated, and reunited in a higher ceremony, are symbolized. The music for this scene is of solemn simplicity and great austere sweetness. Above all, the two clear and limpid motifs of purification resound in it. These themes alternate and intertwine with the broad and religious motif of baptism and blessing. This is followed by the scene of the Good Friday spell. Parsifal turns to observe the forest and the meadow, and expresses his admiration for the purity and beauty of the herbs and flowers, and feels connected to them through an intimate communion. It seems to him that they speak to his soul in a dear and familiar language. It is the spell of Good Friday, Gurnemanz tells him, and continues by revealing to him the joy of nature, purified and regenerated by the sacrifice of the Redeemer. A piece of music of truly incomparable beauty accompanies this scene. It begins with the theme of the blessing and baptism. Then comes the theme of the lament of the Redeemer, which was already present in the prelude. Then a new theme is heard, belonging to this scene, a pure and melodic theme of a rustic and pastoral nature, expressing the enchantment and joy that emanate from the grass, the flowers, from all of regenerated nature. But suddenly the calm melodic wave is interrupted by dark and agitated sounds. It is the moment in which Gurnemanz says to Parsifal, "This is the holy day of passion," and the music expresses the sufferings of the Redeemer and his sacrifice of love, with the motif of the mystic supper and love, and with the theme of the lament of the Redeemer. But soon the music calms down, the theme of regenerated nature resounds again, there is a hint of the Grail theme. Finally, the second theme of purification joins with that of regenerated nature in a finale full of freshness. The last great scene of the drama takes place once again inside the temple. The knights enter, carrying Titurel's coffin, the litter on which Amfortas lies, and the Grail. The knights surround Amfortas, enjoining him in the name of Titurel to perform his office for the last time. Amfortas rises with a desperate effort. He tears away the bandages covering his wound, and begs the knights to kill him, the sinner, and with him his torment. Then, he says, the Grail will illuminate itself. At this point, while the deeply disturbed knights have made way for Amfortas, Parsifal approaches him. He raises the holy lance and touches the king's wound with its tip, saying, "Only one weapon will suffice. Only the iron that opened it can close the wound. Be healed and purified, because now I fulfill your office. Blessed be your suffering, which gave the timid simpleton the supreme power of piety and pure wisdom." At the magic touch of the sacred weapon, Amfortas's wound heals as if by an enchantment, and he, his face beaming with joy and overcome with deep emotion, lets himself fall into Gurnemanz's arms. Parsifal proceeds toward the center of the stage, and turning toward the knights, calls them to witness that the Holy Lance has been redeemed and is reunited with the mystic chalice. The magnificent music of this scene begins with the Grail motif, which corresponds to Parsifal's words, "Only one weapon will suffice." The moment of the healing touch of the lance is indicated by a new motif, which develops from a modification of the motif of Amfortas's suffering, a modification that gives it a sweeter and calmer character. It is the motif of transformed suffering. The musical motif of the promise, or of the pure and simple, follows. Then the motif of Parsifal is played fortissimo in a triumphant tone. When Parsifal says to the knights, "Here I surrender the Holy Lance," a new motif is heard. It is the mystical theme of redemption that Wagner, with fine intuition, has drawn from the theme of the supper and of spiritual love. The first two bars are the same, but then the theme of redemption, instead of descending like the other, continues to rise in the high notes, as if to indicate the free ascent of the Redeemer and the redeemed to the higher spheres of being. The theme of the miracle of the Grail ends the piece, which shall now be performed. After having healed Amphratos and placed the holy lance on the altar, Parsifal commands, "Open the casket, uncover the Grail," and kneels in silent adoration before the chalice. The invocation is followed by the Spirit's response. A ray of superhuman light descends from above, making the Grail sparkle. Parsifal rises and gently waves the chalice, facing the knights in a sign of blessing. Kundry, who has been staring fixedly and intently at Parsifal as if in ecstasy, slowly lets herself fall and lies prostrate at his feet, while a white dove descends from the top of the dome and hovers over Parsifal's head. Then, from the top of the temple, heavenly choirs, joined by voices of the knights, sing in praise of Parsifal, miracle of supreme salvation, redemption to the Redeemer. With this grand celebration of the victorious spirit, Richard Wagner's sacred drama ends. The profound meaning of this scene will not be difficult to grasp for those who have understood the intimate meaning of what precedes it. We see in this scene the marvelous powers of good that can be exercised by the initiate, the perfect man, the master in whom the will, wisdom, and understanding are completely and harmoniously developed. With the magic power of the will, which has rescued him from enslavement to the lower nature, he knows how to heal bodies and redeem souls. With spiritual love, with the adoring dedication that inspires his being, the human feminine principle has sublimated and risen up to him, abandoning its own limited manifestation, its own ordinary strength. Matter, nature, the negative pole of manifestation, united with the positive pole, the spirit, the great dualism has manifested life, is resolved into a supreme unity. I will add just a word about the final words sung by the choirs. In the earliest version of the drama, they were different from those just mentioned, and were as follows: "Great is the fascination of desire, greater still is the power of renunciation." This conclusion, with its clear Buddhist flavor, is a wonderful synthesis of the philosophical meaning of the drama, but the new version was rightly preferred by Wagner because it has a deeper meaning. In fact, the words "miracle of supreme health, redemption to the Redeemer" allude to the fact that Parsifal was bound by his sacred vow to find Amphratos and heal him, and therefore by redeeming him, he also freed himself. This is in complete harmony with the great Eastern teaching, perhaps the highest, that great souls, having reached the threshold of final liberation of nirvana, can renounce it in order to remain in the world to help suffering humanity, and vow to continue to fight and suffer with it until every human being has attained liberation and redemption. Thus, these masters of compassion, these heroes of supreme renunciation, can and will achieve their own redemption only as they redeem others. The music of this finale, which begins with the silent prayer of Parsifal before the chalice, is worthy of the highest significance of the scene. It is the most purely mystical music in the whole drama. No human voice, no accent of pain, no element of imperfection disturbs the sacred harmonies of the high spiritual spheres expressed by the motifs of the Grail, redemption, and faith, which alternate and intertwine many times in an admirable musical fabric. The solemn moment of the descent of the mystic dove is indicated by the crescendo and diminuendo of a long note held by the violin. With this music, Wagner has truly reached the highest peaks of art and spirituality. Thank you for listening to Readings from Roberto, and we hope you will tune in to our next reading. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to share the wisdom.